everyone, I'm Hone, and believe it or not, Core Set 2019 Limited is already starting to wind down. The full spoiler for Guilds of Ravnica will be out in about a month, on September 19th, meaning it will be time for me to start diving into my set review for a new limited format. As always, when a set starts winding down and I feel like I've gotten enough drafts in, I like to go back and talk about what I got wrong in my limited review. It's impossible to do a perfect job on these things. It's often hard to judge cards without actually playing with them, and as a result, I'm usually wrong about around 10% of the cards. After Dominaria, where I was wrong about considerably more cards than usual, and off by a wide margin on many of them, I was once again wrong about around 10% here. In this video, I'm going to revisit about 26 cards that I was wrong about by more than a half letter grade, and discuss why I think I got them wrong. If you missed my set review and don't know how I grade cards, you can find a link in the description below to a video where I explain how I grade them. Now let's get started with white, which is tied with red for the color I messed up on the most, with 6 cards that I want to talk about. I envision this being a decent combat trick in the format. I thought it would be nice that it could save your creature from damage or -X based removal, while also being able to help your creature win in combat. Turns out, while the former is true, this is pretty bad in combat. Creatures often just don't line up the way you want them to for this to work. Yeah, you may save your creature, but you're not going to be getting anything out of your opponent in return most of the time. As a result, I have it behind the other white combat trick in the set, Mighty Leap. I gave this a C originally, thinking I would want one in most of my white decks, but I quickly found out that wasn't the case, and don't think you should play it in most cases, and it's dropped all the way down to a D for me. Next up is Cleansing Nova, a card that I really underrated. I didn't think it was bad, mind you. I thought it was a first pick in most packs and gave it a B-. I'm always a bit skeptical about board sweepers, and I don't want to give them high grades because there are definitely decks where they are suboptimal, like in aggro decks. But yeah, they're still really good there, and I probably underrated this a little too much while trying to keep in mind that it's not always going to be incredible. But guess what? Most of the time it's just incredible. Sure, sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you can't cast it, but guess what? That means your opponent's board position is bad and yours is better, so what's the big deal? It is a great reset button, one you can play with the knowledge it is coming, so you can wait for your opponent to overcommit on board and cast this. Additionally, the fact that it can alternatively take out artifacts and enchantments gives it some additional use, even in a game where you don't want to use the Destroy All Creatures part. There are plenty of playable artifacts and enchantments in this set that this blows up. In the end, I think I was off on this by a whole letter grade, and I'm willing to push it all the way up to an A-. I think it's one of the best cards in the set now. Next is Inspired Charge. We've seen this card before and it wasn't all that inspiring, but as is often the case, cards can be a lot better depending on the format. I thought Inspired Charge would basically only be good in one deck, the red, white, go wide deck, and I wasn't wrong about that. I mean, it is really good there and it's best there, but the problem is I gave it a D in your typical deck and a C+ as a build-around grade in a deck that goes really wide. But it turns out most decks in this format are heavy on creatures. In most formats you end up with around 15-ish and feel like you have a lot of creatures. I find myself with 17 or 18 here, kind of on average, even if my deck isn't the red, white, go wide kind of deck, and as a result, a card like the Charge actually becomes playable in most decks with white in them. As a result, I think it's just a straight C in your typical deck in the format. I'm happy running one in any white deck with 15 or more creatures, which is basically all of them, and it moves all the way up to a B in like the red, white, go wide deck. Next we have Knight of the Tusk. This is a card that I overrated. It has some nice stats, and Vigilance pairs well with those stats, but it certainly isn't the C- that I gave it. This format leans a little fast. There's definitely a fun police kind of deck in red-white aggro, and you have to be ready to deal with that. And playing a 6-drop that doesn't do anything isn't a good idea. It needs to have really good stats, or it needs to have a good ability, and this doesn't do that. Sure, some decks play defensive, but they're going to opt for much cheaper creatures to fill that role so that they can survive the early game. My only excuse is that I still have Dominaria on the brain a little, and in that format this probably would have been something like a C-, but in this one, I think it's probably a D-. I think you should basically never play it. It's too slow and too unimpactful. Next we have Lea Vanguard. I am always skeptical of 1-mana 1/1s. They quickly become irrelevant, and yeah, this one becomes a 2/2 on a big enough board and gains you life. As I noted in my set review, it is kind of cool that this has a place in both black-white decks that want to gain life, and red-white decks that want to play aggressive. Even though I said all of that, which I still think is right, I underrated the card a little too much, giving it a D and saying you just won't usually play it. But I was wrong. This card is pretty great in red-white aggro decks where it is almost always a 2-2 and gaining you life. Backed up by things like Inspired Charge and Combat Tricks, it can attack for a while. And it isn't unheard of for this to be a 2-2 on turn 2 in those decks thanks to Goblin Instigator. It can really help you get in for damage early in those decks. Meanwhile, in a deck with a life gain payoff, or several life gain payoffs, like Epicure of Blood and Ajani's Pridemate, the Vanguard takes on a whole other dimension, since it is one of very few reliable sources that are repeatable of life gain in this set. All of this might sound like I think the card is incredible, but I still don't. It's still the kind of creature that you really want on turn 1, and it becomes less impactful and less good the longer the game goes on, but it does have some small impact even in the late game, especially in a black-white life gain deck, and I think this is perfectly playable in basically any white deck, although, again, red-white and black-white are probably the best, but I think it's a solid C now. Next we have Revitalize. I'm not really sure what made me think the way I did here. I'm usually quite skeptical of cards that only gain you life, but this one replaces itself, and I thought that meant it would be worth it, especially in a deck with life gain synergy, but it just doesn't do enough. It doesn't do enough still, even though it draws you a card. It isn't completely unplayable, but I gave it a C-, indicating that you feel okay about having this in your deck, but you really don't. You play this as a 23rd or 24th card when you're desperate, and that's about it, and as a result, I think it's a D. Now let's move to blue, where there are 4 cards I want to revisit. First, there's Departed Deckhand. I was very high on this card from the start. I gave it a B-, making it first pickable over things that aren't really good removal or bombs. I actually got a lot of backlash about that grade in the comments, with some people saying they thought the card was just bad, but I was actually underrating it. People get hung up on the fact that it dies when it is targeted by a spell. Yes, it turns your opponent's auras and combat tricks into removal, but so what? This means the worst case scenario here is still a 1-for-1, which is okay, especially on your 2-mana creature. Usually they're going to spend more mana than you did to kill it. But the upside here is insane. If it isn't killed, it just takes over the game and it ends it single-handedly while getting in for 2 a turn and making its friends unblockable. This card gets pretty close to bomb level, especially for an uncommon, and I happily take it now over anything that isn't the top level of removal, like Lightning Strike or Murder, and think it is probably the best non-rare creature in the entire set, and I think it's moved all the way up to a B+ for me. Next up we have Metamorphic Alteration, and this is an interesting card. It was really polarizing. LRcast said it was really bad, LSV said it was mediocre, others, including myself, said it was really good, and I gave it a B. In the end, I think we were just all wrong. This thing is just a C. Sure, there are games where it's super insane and upgrades one of your creatures a massive amount or downgrades your opponents a huge amount, but there are also times where what it does is super negligible. And since it doesn't actually just remove the creature, it just transforms it, sometimes that can be a real headache. There are board states where it's not very good, basically only getting you 2-for-1, and that prevents it from being the first pickable card I imagined. Basically, I look too hard at the best case scenario, I think some others look too hard at the worst case, and because both of those things are things this can do, they're real board states. Like if you draft this, you're going to have both of these things happen. I think you're going to have board states where it's useless and board states where it's incredible, and I think in the end that makes it sort of average out to a C. Next is Patient Rebuilding, which I gave a C+. I think I got fixated on the fact that people would want to mill people out with this, and I don't think mill strategies are usually viable and limited, though we'll see they kind of are in this format as this video goes on. But I did even say in the set review that the fact that it draws you cards makes it way more playable than most cards that just mill your opponent. So I gave it a C+, thinking, you know, if I'm a blue deck, I probably play this and feel pretty alright about it, but that's about it. Still, I was worried that red-white would be way too fast, and playing something like this in that format could be a good way to get dead. If you're playing something that doesn't impact the board on turn 5, and your opponent's curving out on you, good luck. And that can certainly happen. Sometimes you just don't have the time to play this, but there are enough tools in place to build a defensive deck that can stand up to aggro, and you can get this in play, and it gives you inevitability in 2 different ways. It's either going to kill your opponent because of your card advantage, or it's going to kill them because it mills them to death. The other thing that makes this better is that there is a legit mill deck in this format, provided you are willing to build around the card we're going to look at next. I still don't think this card is as big of a bomb as some do, just because sometimes you just don't have time to play it. There are legitimately good aggro decks in this format, and you have to be prepared to deal with them if you want to actually play this card. But it is definitely first pickable in most cases, and I'm giving it a solid B now. Next we have Psychic Corrosion, the other blue mill card in the set. I'm always skeptical of pure mill cards in Limited. They appear in a lot of formats and they don't pan out very often. As a result, I argued people should steer clear of this thing and I gave it a straight up F. However, I think it would be more fair to give this a build around grade. I do still think it's an F in your average blue deck. You need a couple of things going on to make it work. First, you need to have a good control strategy, including good defensive creatures, good removal, and so on. Second, you have to have at least a few of the powerful blue card draw spells like Sift or Divination. If you're tapping into red, maybe something like Tormenting Voice. If you have all of those things going on, you suddenly have a real mill deck on your hand, and I think this moves it all the way to a B- when you really get there with the card. I will say I think people still play this card too much in scenarios where they don't meet the two requirements I just mentioned, but it can be a real win condition in blue control decks in the format. Next up is black, where I did the best job because I was only wrong about one card, and that card is Abnormal Endurance, which I gave a C- in my set review. I think I got a little hung up on the fact that it's just a worse supernatural stamina when I gave it a C-, and while it is definitely worse than the stamina, this format is a great environment for a card like this, and it actually makes me wonder whether or not they originally had supernatural stamina in the set and realized it was too good and decided to make a strictly worse version of it because the original card, supernatural stamina, was just too good for the format. This is good in most black decks, and I usually want one in them. The reason for this are the preponderance of black creatures at common and uncommon who have legit into the battlefield or death abilities that make this have some serious value, sometimes granting you something like a 3-for-1. Just looking at black and just the commons and uncommons, this pairs really well with Gravedigger, which will get you a creature back, Doom Dissenter, which will give you a zombie, Fell Spectre, which will make your opponent discard a card and do 2 damage, Plague Mirror, which will give -1/-1 to your opponent's whole team, Skeleton Archer, which will do 1 to something, and Vampire Sovereign, which will drain the opponent for 3. And that's a pretty long list of cards that when you use Abnormal Endurance on them, they not only kill the creature that they were blocking and now come back into play, you get their Into the Battlefield trigger again. And those are all very powerful ones. I mean, Skeleton Archer, maybe a little less so, but it is relevant. And I didn't even mention Skymarch Bloodletter, mostly because its ability is a lot harder to get an entire card of value out of, but when you're already getting like a 2-for-1 and then you drain your opponent for 1, it's pretty nice. If you go into other colors, things get even sillier. Suffice it to say, I think this is the best combat trick in the set. I've been blown out by it and blown out enough people with it that I'm confident in saying that it gets just about the highest grade a combat trick can get. They have inherent weaknesses, and this one still has those. It's awful if your opponent has instant speed interaction, for example, but still, this goes a C+ for me. From a color where I only wanted to reevaluate one card, we go to red, a color where I was wrong about a whopping 6. First up, we have Catalyst Elemental in red. I guess I didn't learn my lesson in Dominario with Skirk Prospector, who I gave a C to when I should have given it a D. I thought this Elemental would be better because, hey, there are dragons in this set, right? But not so much. In the end, this creature still isn't worth it, other than in the most extreme of situations where you somehow have a lot of high curve and you just don't have enough of the actual good ramp in the set. Even then, I think if you're playing this, you're in trouble. The mediocre stats it has are bad, and when you really think about it, you are actually getting a net loss of -1 mana when you use this, since you paid 3 to cast it. In a way, this Elemental basically makes you discard a card for -1 mana. Sure, it jumps you up some mana for a turn, and sometimes that's awesome, but it will frequently also just be a Grey Ogre. I gave it a C originally, and I think it's bumped all the way down to a D, much like Skirk Prospector in Dominaria. Next, we have Double Cast, which I originally gave a C+ to. I thought there would be enough situations where this actually did something, like when you cast Divination or a powerful removal spell, and sure, that can happen, but when you really think about it, it's not that impressive. If you cast it on Divination, for example, sure, you're drawing 4 for 5 mana, but you're also essentially discarding a card for the effect. Not saying it's still not good, but it's not as good as it sounds. With Lightning Strike, yeah, you basically have a second copy in your hand, and that can be nice, but this just does stone nothing way too often, and as a result, in all but the most spell-happy decks, I think this is pretty awful and nigh unplayable, and I'm dropping it all the way down to a D-. Next, we have Fiery Finish, which is a nice removal spell, but not the B that I said it was. Many people said I was wrong about this one, and you guys were right. Sure, it effectively says destroy target creature, but it is only sorcery speed and really expensive. There are some matchups where it's just bad, like any matchup where your opponent's really aggressive and their curve ends at 4, both because they're just going to kill you before you get to 6 mana, and because even when you do cast it, you're spending way more mana than they did, so it isn't so good for tempo. I have found myself citing it out in some matchups, which certainly means it isn't the high-quality removal spell I thought it would be. It is just too clunky to be anything close to premium, and I've downgraded it all the way to a C+. Next, we have Goblin Motivator, who I gave a D to originally. We've seen functionally identical versions of this card before, and most of them have been Ds, but I have found that the Motivator is actually pretty solid, and better than most of its predecessors have been. It does particularly well in red, white, and red, green. In red, white, it lets you do way more damage, way more quickly. Playing this on turn 1, then Viashino Pyromancer on turn 2, or Oresco Swiftclaw on turn 2, does some serious damage early, and its ability remains relevant all game long. If your opponent manages to start to stabilize, the Motivator can really undo that by giving haste to any new creatures you play. In red-green, it less frequently does sweet stuff early, but it lets your Colossal Dreadmaws and friends gain haste, and that can be nasty damage out of nowhere. Basically, in a format as creature-heavy as this one has proven to be, the Motivator defied my expectations. It also doesn't hurt that it's a Goblin, and there is both a very good uncommon and a solid rare payoff for having Goblins. All in all, I think you play one of these in most of your red decks and feel pretty happy about it. I'm giving it a C now. Next we have Hostile Minotaur, who I gave a C2 in my set review. I figured this did an okay job on the French vanilla test as a 3/3 with haste, but overall this card has been really underwhelming. There are too many good defensive creatures who make it irrelevant, and I have found that it is really only decent if you cast it on turn 4. After that, the board is just hard for it to bust through. The stats just don't match up well enough in this format, especially for 4 mana. It sort of switched places with the Motivator. The Motivator went from a D to a C, and I think the Minotaur goes from a C to a D. I just don't play this card in ideal scenarios. Our final red card is Lava Axe, a card that is often not very good, and honestly it's still not that good in this format. It's just not as bad as I said it was. It's basically only useful when it is straight up killing your opponent, otherwise you're basically mulliganing. But in this format, there are decks that are fast enough that chucking a Lava Axe at your opponent on turn 5 is a good way to end things. I still think it is way better to win with one of the board pumping strategies like Inspired Charge, and I don't think the Lava Axe is very good, but it isn't completely unplayable as I predicted when I gave it an F. Instead, you play it in some corner cases as a 23rd card, and I think that means it's a D. Let's move to green now, where I want to look at 4 cards. First, let's talk about Hungering Hydra. I gave this card an A-, and I included it as the number 10 biggest bomb on my list of the biggest bombs in this format. And in both videos, people told me I was overrating it, and you guys were all right. The Hydra is certainly still a great card. It just isn't one of the biggest bombs in the format good, and certainly not deserving of an A-, which is what I gave it initially. Sure, it is big and hard to kill and just keeps getting bigger, but a complete lack of evasion makes it a lot worse than I expected. What's more is you need to have it be pretty decent size from the start, like a 4/4, for it to really be a problem, and paying 5 for a 4/4 isn't exactly a good rate. Luckily, this does have a ton more text than that, and that matters, and it's still a good card, and one you should first pick over basically all the uncommons in the set that aren't Murder, Lightning Strike, or Departed Deckhand, but it isn't the bomb I hoped. I think it's just a solid B. Next is another rare, Prodigious Growth. If you know me, you know I'm always super skeptical about auras that don't give me some value, even in a fail case. Like Knightly Valor gives you a Knight token, or like the Cartouches and Amonkhet, which all gave you something when they came into play, and as a result, I didn't like Prodigious Growth very much. I gave it a C-. The problem with auras that do nothing more than boost stats and don't have like some sort of value they leave behind is you open yourself up for an easy 2-for-1 from your opponent. And I hate all-in strategies like that. But as a result of this skepticism, there's usually at least one aura I underrate in every set, and that's what Prodigious Growth is here. I didn't think it was unplayable, but I thought it was pretty medium with that C-. However, what I didn't think about is this basically does give you instant value, even if your opponent does 2-for-1 you. Sure, it doesn't come down and give you an Enter the Battlefield trigger or something like that, but by making any creature on the battlefield a threat with Trample, it pretty much guarantees that it either smashes your opponent really hard or takes down a bunch of creatures because they can't take that kind of damage. It still has the problem auras have. If you play them into untapped mana from your opponent, you could easily be in a world of hurt, especially casting one that costs 6 mana, but the risk is worth it with this card. I still don't think you first pick it or anything close to that, but I think in an ideal world, you would have one of these in most green decks. I'm going to give it a C+. Next is Vinemare, which I gave a C+ to. I like the stats and the hexproof, and the fact that it was unblockable some of the time, and the fact it was a great place to stick auras. I mentioned all of those things in my set review, but I underrated just how good that combination of things can be in giving it that C+. I found it to be pretty powerful even in a deck with 0 auras because it has such good stats and hexproof. If you have auras, then it just gets insane. Have fun putting Ether Tunnel on this and making your opponent groan. I think the mare actually moves all the way up to B, between the great floor it has and the stupid high ceiling. Next is the only Planeswalker I was significantly wrong about, and that is Vivienne Reid. I gave her a B-, a pretty good grade indicating that she should be first picked a significant portion of the time, but she's better than that. I wasn't super high on her. I was worried about the fact that her -3 ability was so limited, and it can be, but there are a ton of flyers in this set that she can kill, and this set has a lot of artifacts and enchantments too. The combination of all of that made Vivienne Reid's -3 better than I expected. She still doesn't protect herself incredibly well, but she is the kind of Planeswalker who it isn't that hard to get significant value out of. Her high loyalty can even enable you to +1 first, trying to find a good way to protect her, and it isn't uncommon to play her and take down a flying creature that is threatening her. Her -8 is also effectively game-winning, and it isn't that hard to get to if you have any board presence at all. She doesn't quite push her way all the way into the A range, but she is a B+, a card to be considered alongside the lightning strikes and murders of the world. Next, let's look at the one multicolored card that I was significantly wrong about. And that is Victus as Madi. I gave him a C+, and remarked that it was the worst of the Elder Dragons not named Arcades. I thought its attack trigger was too erratic to really be worth it, and that there would be board states where it would kind of suck to have to do to your opponent. And I wasn't wrong. I just overrated how often it would be bad. It is almost always good since you get to make the choice. You get to sacrifice a land and potentially get a permanent out of it, while you get rid of your opponent's best permanent and probably downgrade it. Sure, sometimes things backfire, and sometimes they have like a land and a creature token in play, and at times like that I really wish it said may. But if that's what they have, your 6/6 flyer is probably going to kill them and still be better than whatever they might reveal. I do still think Nicol Bolas, Palladium Ores, and Chromium are better than Victus, but it is much closer to them than I initially thought, and I think it's moved all the way up to a B. Next, we'll look at the last group of cards, artifacts. First, I want to talk about Arcane Encyclopedia, which I gave a D. I was concerned that this would be a format where you didn't have time to dirtle around with this, and while that can be true, and there are certainly plenty of decks in this format that don't want the Encyclopedia, it is pretty nice in the grindy control decks you can build, and combos pretty well with Psychic Corrosion, by the way. If a game goes long, the player with the Encyclopedia in play is just going to win because of their card advantage, and I feel fine about having one of these in decks that have the means of making the game last for a while. Decks with defensive creatures and good removal. You still shouldn't play this in an aggro deck, but I think it deserves a C rather than the D I originally gave it. Next, let's look at Chaos Wand, which I gave a B- to, thinking it would be really powerful. It doesn't quite live up to that, instead living up to the chaos in its name, and it's way too reliant on what your opponent has in their deck. There are powerful instants and sorceries in this format, to be sure, but not enough that this is always going to be striking gold. Lots of combat tricks in this format make it pretty bad, and sure, when you do hit that Lich's Caress, it feels awesome, but when you look at how many times you activate it versus how many times it actually does something, the numbers don't look so good. It is a 7-mana investment initially, and for a turn after that is a lot, but it is a decent mana sink, at least if you're flooding out, this is a good thing to be able to do. I don't think the card is unplayable by any means, but many people seem to be taking it pack one, pick one, and I don't think that's right most of the time because of how chaotic this card is, and I'm going to give it a C now. Next, we have Millstone, which I gave an F to for the same reason I gave an F to Psychic Corrosion. I'm of the I'll believe it when I see it opinion when it comes to mill decks and limited, but as we discussed with Corrosion, you can legitimately build a mill deck in this format, though it isn't always going to come together. When it does, though, Millstone gives you another way to grind your opponent's deck into nothing. Because it is actually playable sometimes, I've moved it up to a D. Now let's move to the last artifact and the last card I want to talk about in this video, which is Transmogrifying Wand. That's right, I was 0 for 2 on wands in this set. Hopefully there aren't any wands in the next set, or you can assume I'm wrong about them. I thought Transmogrifying Wand was pretty sweet. Being able to turn your opponent's best creatures into 2/4s is awesome in the right scenario. But I was also concerned that it wouldn't have much of an effect sometimes, so I gave it a C+. However, there were some unforeseen things that made this card better than I expected. One of these is that it combos really well with creatures who do stuff when they die, like Dragon Egg or Doom Dissenter. And while that isn't the ideal use of the card, it is definitely upside that I have found myself using with it. Additionally, there are just a lot of big scary creatures at lower rarities in this format, and a lot of bombs at higher rarities, and the wand's ability to just turn them into 2/4 oxen is pretty nice, especially because you can do this 3 times. Overall, I actually like first picking this card. It has places where it isn't as good, like an aggro deck, but even then I find myself playing it. It just doesn't perform nearly as well, since 2/4s are actually a bit of a problem. I think it is more deserving of a solid B. Alright, that does it for my second look at Core Set 2019 Limited. The full set limited review for Guilds of Ravnica will begin in a little more than a month from now, which is pretty crazy to imagine. In the meantime, I'll still be drafting some Core Set 2019 and posting videos of it every Monday and Thursday as usual. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch my future videos relating to MTG Limited, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon to make sure you get notifications every time I upload a video. Thanks for watching.